Poverty in the Classroom by Mackenzie Coulter, Taylor Schmitz, and Amelia Walsh. According to Connell in his article, Poverty in Education, poverty is not a single thing nor a simple concept. On a world scale, distinctly different situations are embraced in the term. Poverty is the effect of unequal distribution rather than the effect of absolute level of resources. There are different forms of poverty. The first is situational poverty, which is typically a sudden, temporary circumstance due to health issues, divorce, or situations dealing with the environment that are out of one's control. Furthermore, absolute poverty includes a scarce amount of necessities. This is a rare case in the United States, and families who are living in absolute poverty often have to base their lives on day-to-day survival. Teaching with Poverty in Mind by Jensen also tells us that relative poverty is the economic status of a family whose income is insufficient to meet its society's average standard of living. Lastly, there is urban and rural poverty. Jensen states that urban poverty occurs in metropolitan areas with populations of at least 50,000 people. The urban poor deal with chronic and acute stressors and are dependent on often inadequate large city services. Jensen tells us that rural poverty appears in non-metropolitan areas with populations below 50,000. In rural areas, there are more single guardian households and families often have less access to services, support for disabilities, and quality education opportunities. The rural poverty rate is growing and has exceeded the urban rate every year since data collections began in the 1960s. The 1960s is also when modern compensatory programs first started. Earlier in this century, most educational systems were segregated by race, by gender, and by class. Along with that, an article by CNN states that free and reduced lunches crossed 50% of students in 2013, compared to in 1989, where it was less than 32% of students. In fact, research suggests that the highest rates of poverty in the U.S. are formed by minority groups. Bryant's article about poverty and race breaks it down to explain how 9.2% of Asians, 29.8% of Native Americans, 29.8% of Latinos, 29.7% of African Americans, and 36.2% of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders live in poverty compared to 14.8% of whites. Unfortunate as it is, Jensen tells us that policymakers, school leaders, and teachers commonly thought of children raised in poverty with sympathy, but without an understanding of how profoundly their chances for success were diminished by their situation.
Those who play an important role in the issue of poverty in education may be surprising to some. To start, we have the teachers. The article, The Effects of Poverty, tells us that they must be able to identify children who are at risk. The teacher should be aware of a few aspects. They must understand that reaching the child's parent or guardian may be difficult and that the student's homework may not be complete all the time. The teacher must be aware of the culture of poverty and be prepared to modify the classroom to help with student success. Overall, the teacher must try to break the cycle of poverty for their students. The children are in serious need for higher level education, and that must be presented through high expectations and standards. Next, we have the students themselves. Students who are in families that are experiencing poverty often have academic and behavioral problems. These problems can cause the student to be unable to focus or keep their concentration on specific tasks. Along with that, the effects of poverty states that they may be unwilling or unable to interact with peers and or adults in school. Lastly, we must focus on the effects poverty has on the parents. While experiencing living in poverty, parents may have financial instability, difficulty accessing programs and services, lack of mental and physical health, lack of opportunity and choice, lack of social participation, lack of security, and lack of respect. All of these can, in turn, affect their children and their academic success. When a parent is unwilling or unable to communicate with their child's educator, the lack of communication can result in lower academic performance from the student. The issue of poverty has become more important than we recognize. A recent study by the National Center for Education Statistics states that in 2013, approximately 10.9 million school-aged children, 5 to 17 years old, were living in poverty. Along with that, the article says that the percentage of school-aged children living in poverty in 2013, 21%, was higher than it was 2 decades earlier in 1990, 17%. In that same study, we found that among children under age 18 living in poverty in 2013, those living in a mother-only household had the highest rate of poverty, 45%, and those living in a father-only household had the next highest rate, 29%. Children living in a married couple household had the lowest rate of poverty at 11%. This evidence was observed throughout all racial and ethnic groups. The overall importance of this issue is that poverty is a larger problem than we recognize and that we are unaware of the amount of students in our classrooms that are experiencing and living in poverty. The National Center for Education Statistics also states that research suggests that living in poverty during early childhood is associated with lower than average academic performance that begins in kindergarten and extends throughout elementary and high school. Living in poverty during early childhood is associated with lower than average rates of school completion. Along with that, we must be realistic as to the effect poverty has on students and their academic success. The article by Gorski says that we often define students by their weaknesses rather than their strengths when it comes to issues with poverty. Instead, we must recognize what the specific student needs in order to be successful academically. For students living in poverty, attendance in school is often irregular, transferring schools is normal, and steering away from social interaction is typical. The effects of poverty states that children of poverty generally achieve at lower levels than children of middle and upper class. These children often experience education in a completely different way than others.
The same article tells us that students' home life prevents them from having the same educational teachings, including the use of computers, attendance at preschool programs, and the availability of literature and educational reading materials. These students often have a smaller vocabulary range, which can increase the risk of academic failure. Some aspects that teachers must keep in mind while working with these children living in poverty are that relationships don't always come easy for these children. They may have lower test scores, act out in class, and have chronic stress that results in anger or disconnection. Furthermore, it is important to recognize that the children may not trust their teacher automatically because they receive a lack of trust from unreliable parents or guardians at home. It is important for a teacher to understand that these components are common for children living in poverty, and rather than trying to fix the issue, the teacher must communicate with the student to create a new way for them to coexist in the positive learning environment. The future of this issue does not involve poverty disappearing as a whole, but we can take the necessary steps to help students living in poverty achieve to their fullest potential. Teachers and school administrators must educate themselves force school involvement to be accessible to all families, reach out to unresponsive parents or guardians, disregard stereotypes, and not assume students are unable to learn and perform to their fullest potential. Along with that, teachers must make their curriculum relevant to their students living in poverty by connection and validating some of their life experiences and accomplishments. This can be done by teaching about issues related to class and poverty while not making it obvious that specific students are experiencing it. Valerie Strauss wrote an article called Public Education's Biggest Problem Gets Worse, and in it she states, inadequate education contributes to the cycle of poverty by making it more difficult for low-income children to lift themselves and future generations out of poverty. And this is the last thing we want to happen. The main goal of this nation it is to increase the amount of families living in poverty. We should also pay particular attention to and focus directly on helping those who are already struggling through it. Common misconceptions about poverty cause others to think it is something it's not, which often forces them to turn their shoulder on the issue as a whole. Rather than forgetting about the issue, we must try to inform others and ourselves about how significant of an effect this has on our nation. With that being said, teachers, administrators, parents, and students must come together to create a positive educational environment for all involved. The issue of poverty is not going to be solved overnight, but we can at least take the steps in the right direction to help those students who are already in the middle of these circumstances. With this, students in poverty can achieve to their highest potential, and we as a nation dealing with poverty can see the light at the end of the tunnel.